Oh, back for a bit more making WeakAuras stuff. So today I wanted to go through a thing that I made, which is basically I've tried to put a load of annotations in all the code blocks in a WeakAura to hopefully make things a little bit more clear about what's going into each bit of custom code and what's expected to come out of it. I've put it on Wago, and hopefully you can see the text on the screen for the link. I made two versions, one where all the code blocks are open so that you can see them straight away, and another where they're all kind of basically closed and it should be back to looking almost the same as if you just made a new icon. But when you change that to C, so you can see the custom, it should be there. So if you wanted to just import one to start using, you would get this template version. But today I'm going to go through this version just briefly. So we'll just start in display and work through all the tabs and the different bits of custom code that could be in there. So the first one is if you put %c into this text, then it opens up this block. Since we're here, let's just mention that you can put a bunch of stuff into here. So say you wanted to show the progress of whatever it is you're showing, and the slash, and then something that you're going to work out in custom. You can make a string like this, and you can see it's already kind of being shown on the icon. You've got this, which is the %p, and then the slash, and then whatever you put into C. In fact, I think if we add in quickly, then it's already been reflected right there. So I think a lot of people don't realise that you don't have to make everything in in custom. If you're going to use %c, you can do a whole mix of stuff. And same without using any custom. You could put %p over %t or whatever, or just some random text. But anyway, so we've got %c in there. If we open up this, this is all commented code. That's why it's grayed out like that. It'll be completely ignored by WeakAuras or by Lua when it's processed. But what I've tried to do is give what's going into each function and then what's expected as a return for each of these code blocks. So for this one, there's kind of two types of WeakAuras generally. You can get either timed ones or static ones, and although the same number of arguments is being sent into each function, what they are is slightly different. So in a timed one, it'll always be expiration time, then duration, then the progress, and formatted duration, name, icon, and stacks. Worth noting that the progress that's sent into here is the same as the %p if you'd used that, and that is actually a formatted string. I think I see quite a lot of custom code in these custom texts that tries to use progress as a number value, which is fine if it's less than a minute long, which is quite a lot of WeakAuras, so I think a lot of people do get away with it. But as soon as it goes over a minute, then that wouldn't become 62, it would be 1:02. It gets formatted up like that. So if you ever do need a value like that, you're much better off actually calculating it yourself with expiration time. The same with formatted duration versus duration. So duration here actually is a number of seconds, where formatted duration is the same as we've got in progress. If it's over a minute, it will be a number of minutes, a colon, and a number of seconds. If you've got a static Aura type instead of a progress one, total and value get sent in a couple of times. They're the same each time. And then name, icon, and stacks. The icon is a formatted texture, string. So you can use escape sequences to actually put an icon texture or any texture from the game into text, and that's what this icon is. It's not just the icon ID or a path, it's a formatted string. And what's expected out of a custom text is just a string. If you return a number, then Lua will coerce that into a string for you, as long as it's just a simple number. And if you return nil, that's fine. It'll just be a blank string, and everything will be fine. So, you could do, if 0 greater than 1, then return, and you don't need to have an else. Else return blank string like that. You can just return nil and it'll be empty. So custom text, it gets used a lot for running any kind of code every frame. There's no kind of blank way to run stuff every frame. You've either got to put it into a custom text, you could put it into an animation, custom animations run every frame, or you could make a separate trigger to run something every frame. Quite often people will just hit %C here and run some code every frame here. There's also onTriggerUpdate, which runs this code less often than every frame. I think people expect TriggerUpdate to run when there's been kind of any change to the dynamic info on an aura, and it really doesn't run that often. I think it runs as often as trigger activation runs, so I think it's only when any trigger changes its value from true to false or false to true. But it might not even be that. I've never investigated enough to nail down exactly when trigger update runs. But if in doubt, expect it to only run on show and hide, the same as from actions. It's generally less useful than people want it to be, and they'll end up reverting to every frame. So in a trigger, the first thing we've got here is required for activation. If you set it to custom, then you get this. This function gets sent into it a table containing a boolean for each of the triggers that you've made. So if you've got 5 triggers, there'll be an array of 5 booleans in there. And you just need to return a true or a false for this whole thing. The usual way people use it is something like return. So here I'm calling this table T. You could call it triggers, you could call it anything you want, but just be consistent throughout. So if you wanted it to, the whole aura to trigger when trigger 1 is true, and trigger 2 or trigger 3. And I would suggest using brackets to really be very clear about what you're trying to do when you make a thing like this. Oh, worth noting as well, I've put a wiki link in each of these to as much info as we've got on the wiki at the minute. So you can always copy this out from WoW and throw it into a browser. I've tried to be brief in these notes, but there's more info in the wiki. So if you make a custom trigger, then the top piece of code, top code block, is the actual trigger itself. What this gets sent into it is a little bit different for each type of custom trigger you're using. If you're using a TSU, a trigger state updater, there will always be an all states table that's sent in first before anything else. Then you'll get an event name and the args that go with that event. If you're not using a trigger state updater, but you are using events in some way, then event name will be first, and then all the arguments that go with that event. And if you're just using a basic status without any events specified, so like a status every frame type of trigger, then there'll be no argument sent in at all. And again, this just wants to return either true or false from the whole thing. You occasionally see people trying to return something other than true or false. I think the expectation is, or maybe they've copied some code from a custom text which is returning a string. In Lua, everything but nil and false will be true. So I think people do get away with that, like they'll return a string and that'll be just the same as returning true, basically, as far as Lua is concerned. The untrigger. So untrigger code is only ever run when the trigger returns false. So if you've got a custom trigger that always returns true, your untrigger will never even get looked at. But say an event fires, your custom trigger assesses that event, decides that it's not something that it wants to trigger on, then the custom untrigger will be fired, and it gets all the same arguments that the trigger got. So whatever type you're using, if you've got an event, you're using a combat log event, then all those same arguments will be sent straight through to the untrigger. So your untrigger can then assess those values as well. So maybe you want to trigger an aura on you doing a crit, and then untrigger an aura on you getting hit again. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but maybe you do. So then your trigger would be you doing that crit, and then everything else, every other event after that would return false, and it would come through to untrigger, where you'd assess it, is this the me getting hit event that I'm looking for? If it's not, then you'd return false from the untrigger. False from an untrigger does not untrigger. So to make an aura hide, you need to return true from the untrigger. Hope that makes some kind of sense. Generally, if you're using, say, a status type trigger, then your untrigger will just be return true, because anytime you're already assessing the value of stuff in the trigger, and anytime you return false from that, you just want it to untrigger the whole thing. And in fact, if you leave this blank, if you leave the untrigger blank, don't put anything in yourself, then WeakAuras will just assume that you mean to return true. So duration info, this again is only ever run when the trigger returns true. So when it does, this code will be run. What gets sent into all of these, so we're into dynamic information code blocks at this point, this set of them. Duration info is the first of them. They all get sent in the trigger table, which is really just something that WeakAuras needs to do for its own triggers, and probably isn't useful at all to us. So you can pretty much ignore what's being sent into the function. And basically all dynamic info functions will start just like that. They won't be specifying any arguments. And there's two types again, just like in the custom text we talked about. You've either got timed or static duration info on stuff, and the returns here need to be formatted in that way. So if you're using a timed aura, then the two pieces of information you need to give WeakAuras to be able to present that timed info is a total duration for the timer and the expiration time, so when it will run out. So say you're just starting a 7-second timer when an event happens, then this is super easy. You can return duration will be 7 and the expiration time will be get time plus 7. Say for whatever reason you wanted to start a timer halfway through its time, then you could change the duration to 14, but the expiration time is still 7 seconds away from this point when it's made, so you'll effectively have a bar that's already halfway run through. So there's a bit of messing about that you can do with these numbers to change what the bar looks like. The other type is a static aura type. For that, you're giving two pieces of information, which is the current value and then the total. But you also need to give another argument that's true. So for that, if I just wanted to show a bar that's halfway complete, but just stays there static, then I could do 5 and 10. So 5 is the current value, 10 is the max value. But then I also need to say true, and that true tells WeakAuras that this is a static timer that's being used, a static value. The most common situation for things like this would be, you might use unit power max and true, and there you've just made a super simple power bar. I'm going to come back to overlays. Let's just go down the basic dynamic info first of all. So duration is the first. Name, very similar to duration. This just returns, it wants to return a string, and this is what will be shown if you use %n in the display tab. Icon info, another piece of dynamic information for the aura. You can either return a path like this, to the icon or to any other texture that you want to use, or you can use the icon ID. These are often easiest to look up on Wowhead or something like that if you can't find them in game easily. Texture is exactly the same information from as icon, but is used for texture type auras and stuff. And stack info is the stacks value, the %s in the display tab if you use it there, and this needs to be a number. We're saying that although you can use the stacks, there's a text area called stacks on an icon, because that's its kind of default usage, is showing %s. You could put text in that text area if you wanted to, but the stack icon, the stack info for the whole aura, the dynamic info for the aura, needs to be a number. And so back to overlays. So overlays are a relatively new thing that were added to WeakAuras, and the idea is more for a progress bar than an icon, but you can have a differently coloured area of the bar, and that can either be static on the bar as the progress bar moves under it, or it can be attached to the bar itself. And so the two different ways you can return information are either you give a left and right point for the overlay. Maybe we could make a quick example. So I'm doing basically, this is just a little test WeakAura that I often use, and basically all it does is it triggers when I move and then untriggers when I stop moving, so it's a super easy thing for me to just quickly trigger if I want to test something. I'm just giving it the duration info like I mentioned before of just a 10-second timer, and then in the overlay if we add, oh no, there's already one added. So in the overlay info, so this is a 10-second timer, and so we're we're using the duration, that 10 seconds, as our kind of relative point. And so if we wanted an overlay to appear between the 2 and 5 second marks, we should, I think, be able to just return 2, 5. So if I move, then it starts, and you can see that white shaded area is between the halfway point, which is the 5 second point, and the 2 second mark. Probably can be a little bit easier if I make that lower opacity. Maybe a bit too low, but hopefully you can still see that. So the timer bar moves underneath that overlay. So yeah, as I say, it's relative to the duration. So if we wanted to move that up to the top of the bar, we could put it between the 8 second and the 10 second mark. There it is, it's up at the top. The other way of using it is to have it attached to the moving edge of the progress bar. And this is done with, first you put a string in of either backward or forward, depending on whether you want it to be on the trailing end of the progress bar or the leading end. And then again a number that is the width of it, again relative to the total. So we've got a 10 second bar. If we want something that's a width of a tenth of that, then we put 1 in. And backward should mean it's on the trailing edge of the progress. And so if we change that to forward instead, you'll see it on the other edge. And just, hopefully all that makes sense, but just worth saying that if we, instead of having this duration info carrying a timer, if we had it as a static thing, so if we're showing a bar that is 40% filled, if I just comment that out for a second. So there's a bar showing 40% done. Just as an example, so it could be your health bar, it could be a power bar, it could be any kind of a static thing. But then instead of the duration that we're using as the relative value for the widths and stuff here, we're using the total, which is 100 in this case. So it's very similar, obviously. If we want it to show between 100 and 70%, then we'll return 70, 100. There it is in that top 30% of the bar. So yeah, overlays can be a super useful way of just showing a bit of extra information on a progress bar. I think the default triggers for health has an overlay that you can just tick in the trigger. Let's have a quick look since we're here. So status health has it's got 2. So you can show the absorb, and that'll be an overlay. Any absorbs that you get will show as an overlay on the bar. And incoming heals as well, you can show as an overlay. And I think maybe power has a default one, yeah, that shows the cost of the cast that you're currently doing. So it'll show it how much the bar is about to decrease by. So back to our code box. So this overlay info, I've tried to explain, some of those concepts that I've just talked about. Also, Infus made a video on his channel, which is Infus on WoW, all about overlays. He's done a couple of them. One of them about custom overlays, which is super useful. And I think all that is also in the wiki. So if in doubt, check that wiki. So I think that's covered all the info that we could be putting into a trigger. Obviously this is kind of the meat and veg of an aura. You're setting a lot of information here, or you can set a lot of information. So conditions, you can run custom code in conditions. Actually, I'm going to talk about actions first, and I'll try and remember to come back to conditions, because the condition code is similar to actions in some ways. So in actions we've got three main sections: on init, on show, and on hide. On init is on initialization, it's when the aura is loaded for the first time. This code is run. And in all these actions ones, and the conditions ones as well, you don't need to put function at the beginning or end at the end. It's basically anything that you would be putting in between those 2 points is everything that you put in these actions code blocks. You can lose those completely. And so nothing is being sent into here. You're not being given any arguments, and nothing is expected to be returned. You never have to return at all. You're just running some bits of code if you want to, if that's what you want to do. Init is used a lot for people to make settings, or if I'm trying to make a table of some info that I'm going to need throughout the aura, then I'll do it in init. And I know that it's always going to be created before anything else in the whole aura runs, and I know it'll be done just once, so it's not like putting it in an every frame trigger where something's going to get constantly created and remade. So init's super useful, gets used an awful lot. On show, exactly the same kind of thing. You're not using a function, all the same as init, but this runs when the aura first shows. And then it won't be run again until the whole aura is untriggered and then re-triggered again. So, you could have a custom trigger that triggers and then triggers again a bit later. Say it's a 10-second timer on a trigger, on a custom event trigger. You trigger once, you trigger again after 5 seconds, so it's not run out the first timer. It won't rerun the on-show code. And that can be super important depending on what you're doing sometimes. And we've also got Unhide, which is exactly the same as on show, but it runs only when the aura is hidden. And so back to conditions, we've got the same kind of thing. Nothing is being sent into this condition custom code, and you're not returning anything. It's just you can fire a few lines of Lua in this area. But the most important thing I think about the condition custom code is that it is only run once as the condition is passed. So in this case, if trigger 1 is active, this code will run as trigger 1 becomes active. And I think because most conditions, if you had a condition for trigger 1's remaining duration being less than 3, you would expect that it would change the property as that condition is passed, as we go less than 3, but then revert the property back again after you go back above 3 in the remaining duration. Obviously, you're just running a snippet of code. The WeakAuras doesn't know what you've done and then what would need to be undone. So if you wanted to have that same behavior, you need to make 2 conditions, one for when that condition is passed in one direction and one when it's passed in the other direction. So if, using that example of remaining duration, if you had less than 3 seconds on the remaining duration, run this code. If you wanted to then undo it, then you would need to have another condition. If the remaining duration is greater than 3, then run this other piece of code that sets it the other way. And lastly, but probably most complex, is the animation section. Custom animations. They each have different stuff going into them, and I expect different returns. That's why I consider it probably the most complex bit. So we'll just go down the list of them. Fade animation, what this is sending in fact, all animations, the first argument they send in is progress. This progress value is a value between 0 and 1, and what that actually kind of represents is decided by this section, time in and duration. So if you have a main custom animation that runs in 5 seconds, then the progress values in all of these animations will change between 0 and 1 over 5 seconds. If you change it to 1 second, then they'll all change from 0 to 1 over 1 second. And then they just keep cycling. It doesn't go 0 to 1, then 1 to 0. It just goes 0 to 1, 0 to 1, over and over and over again, over this time given. If you set it to relative, say you set it to relative and 100%, then the progress value will go from 0 to 1 relative to the aura's progress. If you've got a health bar and you're at full health, then progress in all these animations will be 1. If you're at 50% health, then it will be 0.5, and so on. So all the animations get sent a progress value, and in a fade animation, which is just changing the alpha of the whole aura, you get a start and a delta. Start is always 1, delta is set by this slider here. So basically what you're going to change to. If I set it to 0, then you can see the default animation is just fading out over the number of seconds given here, over 2 seconds in this case. Slide animation, very similar, but we've got X and Y for this. So we've got the same progress. What's been sent in is start X, start Y, basically this position here, and also delta X, delta Y, and they are these sliders here. If I set them something else, you can see this start to move. And you're expected to return an X and a Y value, so just a position at that point in time. Zoom can scale in both X and Y directions, so similar to the position with X and Y, we've got scale X and Y, start and the scale. So you could have it just stretch vertically or just stretch horizontally. And color. So we're getting sent in here the progress value, same as all the others. We've got RGB A1 and RGB A2. So that's red, green, blue, and alpha, and we've got 2 sets of those color data points. The R1, G1, B1, A1 is set here in the aura's overall main color in the display tab. The R2, G2, B2, A2 are set in this color picker on the animation tab. And so a normal gradient color animation will just change from the display tab's value to this animation tab's value. Can you see that happening there? And what's expected to be returned is just an RGBA set of values. Start and finish are all the same as these things, except they run through their duration once. So if I set this, so say we set a start animation time of 1 second, then the custom functions in here will get a progress value of 0 to 1 over 1 second, and then instead of like the main animations where it'll keep cycling, in this case it will go from 0 to 1 and then immediately start looking at the main animations. That's the last time it'll run the start. And same with end, but probably worth mentioning that with the end animations, it can only get triggered, this finish animation, when your aura has untriggered. So it's gonna fade out after you've already untriggered. Sometimes that'll mean that all the dynamic information will go away or stop being what it was, and so you occasionally see people use a finish animation and the icon does something really weird looking, like the icon changes back to a question mark instead of being what it was. And that's why. It's because the trigger that was true has untriggered, the information has gone away. You'd have to code around it if you didn't want it to do that. One other thing, actually, there's also in texture type auras, there's a rotate as well as these other animation types, and that sends in progress start in degrees, so the current rotation set in the display tab, and just like these other ones, it's got a slider for the number of degrees, the angle that you're changing it to in the animation, and you just return a number between 0 and 360 to be the output number of degrees. So that's a rough explanation of, I think, all the code blocks that you can use in a WeakAura. Again, these links are on Wago, so please do check those out. You can use this template one as an input and then use it as a basic icon from there on, and then anytime you use a custom block, it should show up with the notations to help you out. I'm going to step away for a couple of minutes, but then I'll come back and use some of these code blocks to make a simple combat timer for when you're in combat with a boss. That's my plan. Be right back.